Good morning. It's great to see you all here. Let's give a round of applause for the band. They've really done a great job today. So, for those of you who have been here, you might remember that our sermon series for this year, what is it called? It's called March Jesus the Black Swan, right? Now, some of you may have forgotten why we call this the Black Swan. So, I want to remind you why we refer to it this way. So, a black swan is actually an event in history that nobody could have anticipated. It's an event that actually changed the entire course of human history. So, an example I gave you in my original sermon was actually 9/11. That was a black swan event that nobody could have anticipated, and it changed the course of human history. And so, it's an event that either at the time was unanticipated or underappreciated. And I told you all for quite a while that Jesus was a black swan figure. If you were alive during Jesus' lifetime, you would not have been able to anticipate that Jesus was going to impact the world in the way that he did. Let me give you a little bit of a statistic so that you can understand why I'm telling you this. Most scholars assume that Jesus was only around from somewhere between 1 and 3 years when he was doing his ministry. Most people put it at about 1.5 years. That's not a whole lot of time to get your ideas out there. Would you agree with that? I have been here for longer than Jesus had his ministry. And I guarantee you that nobody's going to be talking about anything that I'm doing here 2,000 years from now. And that's why I find Jesus to be so fascinating. Because when you look at his movement, first of all, it wasn't around for that long. There weren't that many people who followed him in his movement, and contrary to what the Gospels will tell you, Jesus was actually not that well known. If you had been alive during Jesus' day, you know who you would have known about? John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is a footnote in the scriptures that we read. But in the day at that time, he was the preeminent prophet of his day. And Jesus would have been a side item. And yet, 2,000 years later, who do we talk about? Jesus. All the time, right? And John the Baptist is now the footnote. One of the big reasons why this happened is because of the way that Jesus taught. He was an amazing teacher. His teachings were simple and yet very, very powerful at the same time. One of the things that Jesus did in order to create his teachings the way that he did is that he was able to take things down, blend them down to their essence. And you know why that's amazing? Is because Jesus, more than likely, he had no formal training in Judaism, in the Jewish law, and he couldn't even read. Yet, he was able to take these teachings and summarize them down into their basic essence. Unlike me, Jesus got to the point very, very quickly, most days when he was teaching, right? He didn't take a whole lot of time to give you background information because he didn't have background to give. He didn't really know that much. He just said what he was going to say and moved on. And people like this about him. They like the fact that it was simple. Do people like things simple? Generally speaking, they do, right? And if it's simple, if it's easy to digest, then it appeals to a broad range of individuals. And in that way, you actually make it so that you say, hey, here's what I got to say. You take it or you leave it. But you know, it does have some upsides and some downsides to the way Jesus ran his ministry. So one of the upsides to the way that he taught is the fact that it gives people like me a job to actually unpack everything that Jesus had to say, right? And one of the downsides is it gives people like me a job to unpack everything that he has to say. There are more than 9,000 different Christian denominations. I'm not joking when I say that. I know we know that the big main ones, but there are over 9,000 different versions of Christianity. I happen to think that if Jesus was just a little more precise about what he was trying to say, maybe you wouldn't have this many Christian denominations all saying, you know what, we got the right interpretation of Jesus. But the one thing that we all tend to agree on, regardless of who they are, most of us, is that Jesus' most important commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, just to be clear, Jesus is not the originator of these teachings. Both of these things come from the Bible. The first one comes from what is known as the Shema. Shema in Hebrew literally means to listen or hear. It comes from Deuteronomy 6, 4-5. And it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one," or the Lord alone. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might." Now, what does Jesus say? He changes might to mind, and then he adds on strength to the end of it. So he doesn't quote it directly. And then he gets to, the second part comes from Leviticus 19:18. And that one goes, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." I love that part at the very end. It's just like coming down on it, right? So none of these things are very unique. All Jesus did was he took these two things and what did he do? Slapped them together into a single unit. And he was not the first person to do so either. In Jesus' day and time, it was very common for teachers to ask each other, "What is your summarization of the law? How would you summarize it? Break it all down to its essence." And so what teachers would do is they would listen around. They would see what other teachers had to say. They would take from books. And there are actually two books prior to Jesus being born. These books were not included in our Bible, but they have these basic summations in them. The first one comes from the book of Dan. And it says, "I love the Lord with all my life, and I loved another with a sincere heart." The next one comes from a book called the Testament of Issachar. And that says, "I love the Lord with all my strength. Likewise, I loved every man with a sincere heart." Pretty similar, right? Okay. These are close to one another. So Jesus, he's borrowing probably from some of these formulations to come up with his own combination. But his combination does have some interesting characteristics. One of the things that he does, which he starts with, like everybody, is he starts with loving God. Usually a pretty good place to start when you're going to summarize the law, right? Can we agree on that one? So last year when I did my Genesis series, for those of you who might be visiting, I did a whole series on Genesis last year. And I talked about how human beings, I believe, have two natures. We have a spiritual nature and a physical nature. And we talked about how in Genesis chapter 1, there's this concept of humans being created in God's image. Now, I do not believe that literally, like that we literally look like God. Like, I don't think that at all. But what I do believe is that humans have a part of them that are like God. We have this spiritual side to us, and that is the image of God within us. We as humans, we tend to be very good at nurturing our physical side, right? We eat, some of us work out, we try to make sure that we're doing the things to keep our physical nature going. But we're really bad at nurturing the spiritual side of ourselves. And the problem is that if you don't nurture both of them, then you're not going to be a whole person. You're going to be incomplete. And one of the ways that people tend to nurture the spiritual side of themselves is by loving and following God. That's not the only way, but that tends to be the way that Christians do it. So how do we do that? What do you do to nurture your spiritual side as a Christian? Well, you come to church like you all are doing this morning, right? That's what we do. We come here, and the reason why you come to a place like this is because we engage in these practices in here that allow us to nourish our spiritual side. But how long does church last? An hour, right? So then you're up and you're gone. Now, you all spend a lot more time nurturing your body in a week, right? At least 12 hours, most of us, right? With all the eating and everything that we do to keep ourselves going. Well, and we spend an hour nurturing our spiritual side. So does that mean I intend for you to be in here 8 to 12 hours a week? Yes, it does. That is what I expect. No. You all come here for an hour, and my goal is to give you the tools so that you can go out into the world and actually live out God's teachings. That's the idea, because when you live out God's teachings in the world, like especially those found that Jesus preaches in the New Testament, you begin to embody God's love. And when you embody God's love, because that soothes your soul, then what happens? That love is going to affect other people, right? It's going to affect your spirituality, it's going to affect other people. And so ultimately that leads us to the second part of this, which is love your neighbor as yourself. Again, Jesus draws from the Bible. And what he does here, though, is really fascinating because he makes an adjustment to this text that is unusual. So he quotes directly from Leviticus 19:18. That's where he starts. But then he actually omits certain words from that text. And usually I'd say, oh, well, he's just summarizing, so of course it doesn't really matter. But in this instance, it means everything. So take a look at this. Look up there. Look at the words that precede, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people. So in the context of this verse, it's defining your neighbor as what? Your people, right? And who are your people in the Old Testament? Who are they? Anybody who's Jewish, right? So you have to love your neighbor if they are Jewish. But if they're not Jewish, well, that requirement falls by the wayside. And so by omitting that first part of Leviticus 19:18, Jesus is not defining who is and who is not your neighbor, which means your neighbor could be anyone. This is huge. You have to realize how important this omission is for understanding Jesus' teachings on love. We do not get to discriminate about who we love and don't love. We are supposed to love everyone equally, regardless of who they are. So whether they be Jewish or Christian, whether they be your husband, your wife, your mother, your father, your daughter, your son, whether it be your best friend or that neighbor you meet down the street. Maybe it's the person who checks you out at the grocery store. Maybe it's that cabbie who drives you to the airport. Maybe it's a criminal who you meet who's in prison. Or maybe it's those terrorists who flew those planes into the World Trade Center on 9/11. You are required to love all of them equally. And I'm the first to tell you that this is not an easy thing to do. In fact, most people would say it's impossible. Because, let's be honest, do we really love everyone equally? No, of course we don't. There's a hierarchy to the people who we love. First and foremost, who do we love the most? Our families, right? Next circle out, what's next? Some friends maybe, right? You have good friends. And then maybe you have a third circle out there somewhere that says that you love some mentors or some leaders. Maybe there's some people who you really respect, who you love in that way. But beyond that small inner circle of friends, most of us, we don't love beyond that. And this is a problem, because if you call yourself a Christian, if you actually care about following Jesus' teachings, then it's kind of important for you to want to live up to what Jesus is asking you to do, right? So if you're discriminating about who you love and don't love, that doesn't work. Therefore, let's ask the question, why are we so bad at loving other people? Why are we so bad at loving people outside that small inner circle of friends and family who we have? Well, I think the answer is actually found in the second part of that commandment, where he says to love your neighbor as yourself. He doesn't say just love your neighbor. He says love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, if you don't know how to love yourself, then you're not going to be able to love your neighbor. And I think it's very important for us to understand and to admit that we are not very good at loving ourselves. In order to love yourself, you have to be able to look in the mirror and accept the person who is staring back at you. You have to be willing to say, I am who I am, and I can't be anybody else. But we are very, very bad at this. We are always striving to be someone other than ourselves. We live in a society where we are constantly bombarded by images of who we should and should not be. Every day, the average American sees more than 3,000 different advertisements. And these advertisements, they not only try to sell us products, but they try to sell us ideals of normalcy. What they show you on advertisements is what a successful life is supposed to look like. If you look like these people who are doing these things and who own these products, then you will be happy. Have you all ever seen the Dove commercial called Evolution? Okay, it's a commercial that came out a couple years ago, and what it is, we're going to watch it in just a second, but it's a commercial that shows you how they make these images that you see every day in advertising. So let's watch it.
Okay, folks, so very quiet, please. Camera's rolling, and we're recording sound.
Now that is amazing to me because that's what you see every single day. No person looks like that. But that's what we see when we look at advertising, right? Advertising has given us standards of beauty and success that are so impossible for us to achieve that it leaves all of us feeling as though it is unattainable, that we are lacking in some way. Society is always telling us that we are not good enough as we are, that we need more if we want to be complete. Indeed, I would say that most of us have bought into the notion that the best kind of human life is a life that is nothing short of perfection. So you need to have the perfect body so that you can marry the perfect person, so that you all can have the perfect children, so that you can live in the perfect house, so that they can all wear the perfect clothes, and so you can drive the perfect car to your perfect job that pays for it all. And by the way, did I mention that you need to make all of this look effortless along the way? I'm not saying that there aren't things about ourselves that we need to change. There very much are things we can improve about who we are. But the improvements that are offered by advertising, these are the very things that are preventing us from being able to truly love ourselves. If you want to be able to love yourself, then you have to be open to the fact that you have limitations. You have to be open to the idea that you have weaknesses. You have to be open and admit that you don't have it all together, that you are a frail creature that is weak and lost and in need of help. In other words, if you want to love yourself, then you have to be willing to admit that you are vulnerable. And we don't like to admit that we have any vulnerability because it makes us feel weak. We like to put on a face that we are strong. We like to put on a face that we have it all together. We like to put on a face that we are invincible. We like to pretend like we are only one step away from those advertisements that we see on television. Ironically, the only people who we allow to see our weaknesses are the people who we love. Your family, your friends, the people who you love, they all know your weaknesses. And the reason why you let them see your weaknesses is because you love them so much. And this is why actually loving your neighbor is so incredibly difficult. If you're going to love your neighbor in the way that Jesus asked you to, then you have to be vulnerable with those people in the same way that you are vulnerable with your family and your friends. And nobody wants to do that, right? Who wants to show their weaknesses to a complete stranger? That's threatening, is it not? Of course it is. And so rather than actually love our neighbor, we tolerate them. We get to know them from a distance, and if we deem them worthy, then maybe we'll show them a glimpse of our humanity. But that's not what Jesus tells us to do, does he? He doesn't tell us to test our neighbor and then love them if you deem them worthy. What does Jesus say? Love your neighbor. Full stop. That's it. And since this is not a kind of love that comes to us very naturally, it means that we have to work at it. We have to work at being vulnerable with ourselves so that we can be vulnerable with others, which leads us back to loving God. A lot of you in here and come to church, I see you every week here. Most of you anyway. And I know that what that means is that you believe in God. But believing in God and loving God, these are two very different things. When you love God, you are opening yourself to the concept that you personally cannot get through this world on your own, that you need help if you're going to get through the things that you have to deal with in life. I'm not saying that we don't need each other to get us through. We do. But there are certain things, and you all know this, there are certain things in your life that only you can deal with, that it doesn't matter how many people you have around you, you have to deal with it on your own, and you have to make it through by yourself. And so when you get to those situations, you have a choice. You can either bear it, grit your teeth, and say, you know what, I'm going to do this all by myself, or you're going to look deep down inside of your own soul, You're going to find God's presence, which, by the way, is in every single one of us in here. And you're going to realize that God is right there next to you and that God's going to help you get through this difficult challenge in your life. In other words, what I'm saying is that when you truly love God, you are allowing yourself to be vulnerable because you're admitting that you have limitations, that you're weak, that you don't have it all together, that you need something else besides you to get through life. And this is the beauty of what Jesus does for us with his commandments. They are circular in the way that they work. This is the neatest thing, the way that he does this. So we start with loving God. That's where we started at the beginning of the sermon, right? And when we talked about that, I said, so when you love God, what you do is you come to embody God's love because you want to follow God's teachings in the world, right? So you go out into the world and you follow God's teachings. You're living out God's love. And then, of course, where does that lead you to? It leads you to loving your neighbors, doesn't it? And when you love your neighbors, the problem is if you're going to really love them, you have to be real with people. You have to show your true self. So that means you got to start working on yourself. So that means you have to love yourself, right? And so you go and you start trying to love yourself, but in order to love yourself, what do you have to do? You have to be vulnerable. And when you're vulnerable, well, in order to become vulnerable, you have to start loving God again. Because through loving God, you're going to find that vulnerability within yourself where you admit that you don't have it all together. And round it goes, so that if you keep working on it, you're going to build each of these things up. Love for God, love for others, love for yourself. So I want to end this morning by saying to you that all you need to be complete is love. You don't need to look any different than you are. You don't need to buy anything. The person staring back at you in the mirror right now is enough. All you need to be willing to do is open yourself and choose love. Choose to love God. Choose to love others. Choose to love yourself. If you are willing to embrace these three things, then I guarantee you, you will find a life worth living. Amen.